Hello and welcome back to the Healthy Middle Ground podcast. I want to try something a little bit weird today, a little bit different, and see how it lands. Basically, like what I want this podcast to be, obviously I've called it the Healthy Middle Ground podcast because there's just so much bullshit in the health and fitness industry, especially when it's directed to I don't know if it's more so when directed to women and mums, but there's just so much crap and there's so much extreme stuff on both sides. And normally the truth is like somewhere in between. Like the truth is like somewhere in between veganism and carnivore, for example. Like, lo and behold, eating vegetables and meat is more healthy for us than one extreme or the other, and it's just like a really obvious example, but it's like that with literally everything. So I want to be like a voice of reason, exploring kind of the middle ground of some of these topics. But what I want to do today is something kind of a little bit different. I want to talk about something that I've been learning a lot about recently, which is evolutionary biology. It's just been over the past few years, it's sort of dripped into my feed and I've read a couple of books on it and it's super duper duper interesting. Evolutionary biology and evolutionary psychology. And basically the idea of this field of research is about understanding ourselves based on our evolutionary past and the evolutionary pressures that we've had to get to where we are today. So it really focuses on like the real basics of human like behavior, as though we're animals, right? Around sex, food, family, social networks, like those really deep like instinctual drives. And it aims to explain why we are the way we are in the context of our evolutionary environment and the pressures that were put on us to evolve in certain ways. So it's basically based on Darwinian theory of evolution, that genes that succeed in the evolutionary environment go on to replicate themselves, go on to reproduce, and genes that lead to behaviors and traits that are unhelpful lead the organism to perish and not to reproduce. And it looks at, in particular, evolutionary psychology looks at how, we're all familiar with the fact that certain traits have then get replicated and in the offspring of successful organisms. So things like, height or being bipedal, like being on two legs and having opposable thumbs and things like that. But what evolutionary psychology does is it then looks at like why we have certain psychological adaptations that we can explain also like the psychological adaptations that we see are also like a direct result of evolutionary pressures, and that's why we are the way we are. And I think that there's a lot inside evolutionary biology and psychology that can explain why we're getting so fat, why there's such a problem with obesity, and why it is so hard to lose weight or manage your weight. Because it is, right? It is difficult and it requires a lot of effort. I try to make that as easy as possible, but it does require a lot of energy and a lot of effort. And evolutionary biology explains why. And it explains largely because we have like a mismatch between the modern environment and the evolutionary environment that we've been in for like hundreds of thousands of years. And the modern environment is only really in like the last 100 years. Like things have changed so rapidly and we haven't evolved to cope with those pressures. So it explains a lot about mental health and things like that as well, which is, a really obvious example. But it also explains a lot about why we're obese and why we're overweight and why we're struggling to lose weight. And looking at that mismatch between the environment that we evolved to survive in and the modern environment explains a lot of what's going on. And it basically comes down to this like like in a nutshell, it's about scarcity versus abundance, right? We've evolved for an environment of scarcity when it comes to food, and also when it comes to, you know, reproductive mates and like lots of other things as well, but we won't talk about that. We've evolved for an environment that is very scarce when it comes to food, and now we have this extremely abundant kind of environment with just as much food as you could possibly imagine. It's so easy to get hold of, it's so easy to eat, and it's so easy to preserve, and we just haven't adapted for that environment. Evolutionary biology in general is very, very countercultural, right? It's not very like trendy or fashionable. We much prefer to talk about things like intuitive eating or whatever, which in my opinion, I've done a podcast on that before, just completely gets everything totally backwards and works off of assumptions that are just completely incorrect. So what I aim to do with this podcast is to kind of give a paradigm shift, right? Which is kind of like what I try to do with a lot of things with my clients, is that like we're conceptualizing the problem wrong. So we can't find solutions to the problem if we're working off of incorrect assumptions. So understanding a bit about evolutionary biology can help you have the correct assumptions and the correct framework and conceptualize the problem correctly so that you can find solutions that actually work. Okay, so I've got like 9 points here for things that we can learn from evolutionary biology. I'll try and keep them concise and to the point. So number one, we are wired to eat as much as possible, right? Like, so our intuition is to eat as much as we possibly can, to get as many calories in as possible, because for most of our history, especially prior to like agriculture, we just didn't have very much food. So if you imagine like going back to hunter-gatherer times, like we might go for months, like days or weeks, maybe not months, but sometimes months without any food. And then somebody kills, like in the tribe kills, like, I don't know, some elephant or something, like whatever it was that we were eating. And now you've got loads of meat, right? And it's not going to keep, right? Tomorrow, once the sun comes up, it's going to start getting hot. It's going to start rotting. The flies are going to get to it. It's incredibly hard to preserve. So we are wired to eat as much of that food as possible, getting as much into our bellies as possible. And we're going to eat to the point where we're so hungry, it's so full and so stuffed that we like can't move and we pass out and we go into like rest and digest. And that's because we don't know when our next, like it's very, very precarious in the evolutionary environment. We don't know when our next meal is coming, and we've got to get as many calories in as possible before what we have is either eaten by something else, eaten by other members of our tribe, or goes off. So in the evolutionary environment, which was very scarce, this worked to our advantage because it would have been really hard to get hold of calories. So it would have played to our advantage to get as much in as possible. But in a world where we've just got so much abundance, this plays to our disadvantage, because there's so much food that if we always eat until we're completely satisfied, if we always eat till we're stuffed, if we always get as many calories in as possible, we're just going to balloon up and we're going to be like a 600-pound person that you see on those American TV shows that's getting cut out of their house. It's also worth noting here that this is our intuition, right? Our intuition is to eat as much as possible and to eat like a lot, so like certain types of food, which I'll get onto soon. And this is where I have a major gripe with intuitive eating, because it suggests that if you listen to your intuition, you're going to somehow gravitate towards your healthy weight. But the opposite is true, right? If you listen to your intuition about food all the time, and you listen to your cravings and you honor your cravings and all of that stuff that's very intuitive eating-y, you're going to end up overweight, and you are going to have too much body fat, stored energy on you. And this is where I say, like in evolutionary biology, it's very, very countercultural, right? Because the the current popular narrative is around some form of intuitive eating, and that's the popular narrative today, to say like honor your feelings, honor your cravings, and listen to like your inner intuition knows what to eat and what not to eat. But the fact of the matter is in the modern environment it doesn't, because it just aims to eat as calorie dense food as possible, as much sugar and as much fat as possible. Like, we are wired to want these sorts of foods. This is where, as well, if we don't conceptualize the problem properly, we end up saying, okay, the problem is that people aren't listening to their intuition enough. And then we teach them to listen to their intuition. And when they listen to their intuition, they're going to end up staying fat. And then we have to create a whole conceptual framework to explain why being fat is healthy, which is where we've got body positivity and we've got healthy at every size, right? And it's ultimately very, very, very unfashionable and very unpolitically correct to say the opposite, which is no, actually having excess adipose tissue, having excess fat is not healthy. You can't actually be healthy beyond a certain body fat, or it is going to have negative impact on your health beyond a certain level of body fat. This is not fashionable or politically correct to say, but it's something that we all really know. So it really works on like a lot of things today, on inverting what our actual instincts are and kind of gaslighting us in a way to explaining that our instincts are different from what they actually are. So my second point is similar to the first, like, whereas we're wired to eat as much as possible, we're also wired to eat in certain types of food. So in the ancestral environment, we would have eaten a lot of meat and fruit, basically. So we're wired to eat things, and like fatty meat in particular would have been a really important source of like essential fats that we need, and that we can't live without. So we're very much wired towards fatty foods and sugary foods. But you'll notice that in the ancestral environment, there is absolutely nothing that has both, right? So you either have fruit that has a high sugar content, and not all fruits have a very high sugar content, or even like vegetables which have a low sugar content, and say like wild wheat and wild oats and all of these kind of grains that would have, and pulses and things like that would have existed. They have a carbohydrate content, and they have fiber, which are essential for our digestion, but for feeding the bacteria in our gut. And on the other hand, we would have had food that's very high in fat, like some lean proteins would have been low in fat, but we would have had certain meats that would have been very high in fat. But you don't have anything in nature that has both sugar and fat together. So you can even think of something like an avocado, right, that has a high content of fat for fruit or vegetable, whatever it is, but it's not sweet. And you can also think of like things like olives, that and we get oil out of like vegetables. We have vegetable oil, we have canola oil, we have things like that would have been, that they're not very high in fat, but you can extract, they do contain some fat and you can extract the fat from them, but they're not sweet, right? There's absolutely nothing in nature that is both sweet and fatty. But the modern food industry, when we look at sort of like ultra processed foods, it combines the two, right? So the food that we really love, everyone's sort of like sugar's bad for you. But when you think about the food that we really love, like chocolate, like cakes, like biscuits, like brownies, like ice cream, like, I don't know, Belgian waffles, like all of those kind of foods, they're very high in fat and sugar. And this is an absolute party in our mouth, and it makes all of our like synapses go off like fireworks. And that's why those foods are so sort of, well, people use the word addictive. They're not really addictive, but this is why they're so alluring and so tempting to us, because we are wired to love both sugar and fat, and combining the two of them together is like sensory overload, and get all the like dopamine response and all of that stuff that we love to like scienceify. And you can compare it to like social media or television, where it's just not something like natural, quote unquote, that we've adapted to cope with. It's something that kind of it feeds off of all of our sort of very natural needs from the ancestral environment, to understand what's going on around us, to understand what other people, our peers, are doing, to learn off of other people. But it kind of like puts it on speed, and we haven't adapted yet. These technologies are very, very new, and we haven't adapted yet to dealing with them. So they completely overwhelm our senses, and some people have like described it as like limbic capitalism, like it completely hijacks your limbic system and drags you in. And I want to just add to this, like, I'm not one of those people who's like ultra processed food, like pointing at things in supermarkets and stuff. I think that you can have some ultra processed food in your diet. Like, I love having ice cream. I love having brownies. I love having, that really like fatty, sugary, calorie dense stuff. It's absolutely delicious and it's amazing. And I wouldn't want to live without it. It's just, we have to, the amounts that we eat today are so out of whack. Precisely because we're telling people, like, honor your cravings and things like that it's okay to eat that sort of quantity of ultra processed foods, and they are bad for us in high quantities. They can be part of a healthy diet, and you can have 10 to 20% of your calories coming from those sorts of foods if you're eating the right number of calories and getting enough nutrients from other sources. But if you have a large chunk of your diet coming from those foods, it's going to be detrimental to your health, mainly because it is going to cause you to gain a lot of body fat. Okay, so the third thing that we can learn from evolutionary biology is that we, or more correctly, our digestive systems are made to extract calories from absolutely everything, right? So if you think about the ancestral environment and the sorts of foods we would have eaten a lot of lean meat, hopefully sometimes some fatty meats, and some cultures had more access to fatty meats than others. We would have been eating things like berries that wouldn't be, really sweet, juicy berries like we have today. They probably would have been a bit sharp a lot of the time. They probably would have been very fibrous. And things like wild wheat and wild corn and wild oats and like all of these sort of grains and things like that would have grown in the wild. And again, they would have been very fibrous, all of these things would have been very hard to digest and quite hard to extract calories from. So our digestive systems are made to sort of deal with all of that kind of like trudge, all that stuff that makes it hard to digest, and to extract calories from it. But then if you look at the kind of foods that we have in the modern environment, right? Even like if you look at, again, ultra processed foods are super easy to break down in our digestive system and extract calories from. They don't take a lot of work to break them down. So this is something that we talk about on my coaching program, where protein and fiber are much harder for the digestive system to break down than things that are like, a cookie or something like that, right? They require a lot more energy from our digestive system, and it's a much more active process to break them down. Whereas the really processed stuff, even just things like white bread, are made to be much more easily digestible. That doesn't necessarily mean they're bad, right? And it's not this big conspiracy. Like the food industry developed because we started with agriculture like 10,000 years ago, and we started making like things like bread and getting things like milk, and then making things like butter and yogurt that last longer and that sometimes are safer to eat. Like we started processing food like 10,000 years ago, and we make it both safer to eat, easier to food that lasts for longer, that doesn't go off so easily. But also often foods are much easier to digest. So when you process like the wheat or whatever that you've grown into like a flour, and then go through the process of making bread, it's much easier to digest than if you just chewed on some stick of wheat. Again, this isn't some massive conspiracy, right? We look at ultra processed foods as in like the stuff that's been created the last 50 years. So cereals, breakfast cereals is another good example. People sort of see it as this like conspiracy theory to like make us unhealthy, and the big food industry and stuff like that. But if you think of the context in which like sugary or processed cereals, breakfast cereals were made by companies like Kellogg's, the context is that it was very hard to get sufficient calories into your child, and we had industrial processes making foods that had a long shelf life and that would get calories into children for a relatively cheap cost, which helped them grow, which helped them be stronger, which helped them fight disease. Today, obviously, we're not where we were at in like the 1950s or whatever, and there's just too much of this stuff. And it's too easy to get calories into your child because there's so much hyper palatable, ultra processed foods that exist, like everything like I mentioned before. And now our children are getting fatter and fatter and fatter. And so we have to like reduce their consumption of that because we actually have an abundance of the stuff that's better for us now, which was quite hard to produce. It still is hard to produce and hard to ship to people and hard to stop from going off and spoiling before it gets to our table. So we have to think about it like the other way round. And now we're sort of seeing this movement going in the opposite direction of everything being more natural, which is a good thing, right? It just sometimes misses like the context in which all of this stuff came out of. Even also, if you look at things like fruit and veg and animals, like, again, you see these posts of like, oh, these fruits and vegetables have less vitamins and minerals than they did like, 50 years ago or in the 1950s and all this like noise about that. But it's not actually true. Agricultural practices have allowed us to create a much bigger yield and to create much bigger, juicier fruits with more like edible parts that contain more calories and more vitamins and minerals than they did in the past. So if you look at like, I buy frozen berries, for example, and like blueberries are these big, I get these big blue, like juicy, sweet berries that these have undergone like probably hundreds of years of like our farming practices, basically manipulating evolution and evolutionary pressures to create more, to create crops that have more yield and fruits that have bigger, a bigger yield in terms of they're bigger, they're juicier, they've got more calories and sugar in them, which is a good thing, right? We wouldn't want to be living off of probably in our industrial environment, like I said before, things like berries or any fruits that you found probably would have been quite hard to find something sweet. They probably would have been quite sour, quite fibrous. Apples that are growing wild probably wouldn't have been that sweet and juicy and big as they are today. So our agricultural practices have even made our fruits and vegetables much more, containing more calories and more nutrients, but they've also made them more palatable. And that's a good thing. That's a good thing for society. And it's not a good thing to have low yield. We wouldn't be able to feed everyone. And likewise, animals and practices around farming animals have made them much bigger than their wild counterparts would be. Like a wild hare would have been really stringy, not that we eat a ton of rabbit or whatever, but it would have been really, really, really lean. And there are stories of, because it's so lean, there are stories of people out in the wild who die because they don't have enough fat source because things like wild hare is so lean. And if you look at things like cows, like it's seen as like this bad thing that we create these big fat juicy meaty cows, but in the ancestral environment there just wouldn't have been animals that were they would have been much leaner, much stringier, much harder to extract calories from. And another great example of how our digestive systems have adapted to extract calories out of everything is alcohol, right? So the reason why we can even process alcohol is because a lot of the time when we were foraging, again, like I'm talking hunter-gatherer style stuff here, a lot of the fruit would have fallen from the tree and then it starts to ferment on the ground. It starts to produce alcohol. And we would have needed to eat a lot of that food. Now, alcohol is like literally a toxin. It's literally like poisonous to us. But we, along with many other sort of monkeys and apes and stuff, and I'm sure other animals or at least mammals, can actually eat those foods that have those fruits that have fermented on the ground, because we have developed the enzymes and whatever to deal with the toxin that is alcohol. It makes us get a little bit giddy and a little bit high, but we can actually eat it and process it and extract calories from it. Okay, moving on to the next point. Number 4. Have you ever heard people say that they have like a second stomach? So if you've just eaten this massive 3-course meal, this like savory meal in a restaurant, you're absolutely stuffed, you can't eat another bite. And then someone brings out dessert and you're like, okay, of course I've got room for dessert, right? This is like a phenomenon that everyone knows. And this is also explained by evolutionary biology, the fact that we have kind of a different sense of fullness for savory and sweet foods. Because if you imagine, right, you're a hunter-gatherer tribe, right, which is what we have evolved for most of our history, right? Not agriculture and stuff like that. Even though that's 10,000 years old, we still haven't completely evolved. We still have evolved a lot more for that hunter-gatherer environment, right? So in that hunter-gatherer environment, someone in your tribe kills, like, I don't know, a wildebeest, or like, I don't know who, like a wolf or a deer or whatever it is you would have been eating in that particular environment. You all like swarm around it. You all have your fill. You eat as all of the thing. You've got to eat as much as possible because tomorrow it's going to go off. You can't preserve it. Flies will get to it. Blah, blah, blah. All that stuff that I talked about before. So you eat as much as you possibly can and you're absolutely stuffed. You can't get any more in. Then someone comes along with some berries, which provide the opposite nutrients to what the meat does. So the meat provides protein and fat and certain micronutrients, and the berries or the fruit would provide carbohydrates, sugar, and different nutrients, right, that are complementary. So for example, vitamin C doesn't exist in meat. That's one of the reasons why the carnivore diet is so bad, right? You have to get vitamin C from fruits and vegetables. So you'd get those complementary, and they complement each other perfectly. What's missing in meat and animal products is available in fruits and vegetables, and vice versa, right? So you're not going to get much protein out of the berries that have been foraged, but you are going to get fiber. You're going to get lots of complementary vitamins that aren't in the meat. You're not going to get fat, but you are going to get, and you're, like I said, not protein, but you are going to get carbohydrates, which are quick energy and are protein sparing. So, if you eat carbohydrates, your body doesn't have to use the protein for energy, and so it can use it more for muscle building and all the other processes that you need in your body. So we have this kind of savory sweet system set up where we can eat a lot of sweet food, a lot of savory foods, but we've still got room for the sweet stuff. We still have a kind of like a second stomach for the sweet stuff, precisely for this reason. Obviously, in the modern environment, that doesn't really work because you've just had like a 3-course meal with way too many calories and probably a lot of nutrients, and now you're not getting berries and stuff with a ton of nutrients. You're getting, say, like ice cream or brownies or some kind of souffle or whatever. And now you're just getting you're getting sugar that you don't need, and a ton of fat that you don't need, and a ton of calories that you don't need. So again, it's how our instincts and our evolutionary drives no longer serve us in the modern food environment. So again, I just want to take a bash at intuitive eating and all of that kind of stuff, because, well, maybe not intuitive eating, but what you hear a lot from a lot of people is like, if you have cravings for sugary foods, there's something wrong with you. There's something like that you need to fix, like your hormones are unbalanced or something like that. But actually, it's the other way round. If you crave sugar, if you enjoy sugar, if you find sugar highly palatable and enjoyable to eat, there's nothing wrong with you. That's actually the correct functioning of, like, I don't know, just your like biological hardware. That's just how it's supposed to be. That is the correct form. And so again, it's about conceptualizing the problem correctly, because a lot of people will say, oh, do you crave sugar in the afternoon? It's because, you know, of your hormones, and you need to do this detox, and you need to reset your hormones. And it's giving a solution, an incorrect solution to an incorrect problem. Whereas if we conceptualize the problem properly, that you are actually wired to eat sweet stuff, right? And that is going to be, that's always going to be there. That is part of your like ancestral evolution. That is part of your biology. That's part of your hardware, and you're never going to get rid of it. And it's actually healthy and it's actually functioning. But that means you're going to have to say no sometimes, and your cravings are not a good indicator of what you need and what you should eat, right? Then we have a proper conceptualization of the problem, and we can come up with a solution that is actually based in reality rather than based in some fantasy la la land. Okay, point number 5 is that we are also, a lot of people sort of say, why is it so hard to eat? Like, why do I eat so much when I'm with other people, right? Why is eating socially so fucking hard, right? So a lot of my clients and myself find it really easy to eat when they're eating on their own, when they're just sort of like normal meals during the week. And then the moment that they're at a family dinner, they eat twice as much. And I do it as well, right? And again, this is again about conceptualizing the problem correctly, because a lot of people think there's something wrong with them because they eat too much when they're in a social situation. But if you think about it, in the ancestral environment, you would have been eating with other people, and you want to make sure you get your share. You want to make sure that you and your offspring get your share, or more of your share, right? You want to get as much as possible. And if you don't eat it, someone else is going to eat it. So it might be particularly important if, like, I don't know, a band of 10 people caught a squirrel, for example. You're going to have to split that up between 10 people. It's not going to be very much meat, right? You have to make sure that you're at least getting your fair share. And if you're given the opportunity, you're going to eat more than your fair share so that other people don't get it. And this then in the modern food environment, again, leads us astray, and we sort of eat and we cram food in and we eat more than we need when we're around other people, because the wiring in our brain is like ringing alarm bells saying, like, they're going to eat all the food and you're not going to have any left, and you need to eat as much as possible. And this is natural. This is like this is instinctual. This is actually your instincts, and it's correct for like the vast majority of human history. But in the modern food environment, we kind of have to do like CBT on ourselves, like cognitive behavioral therapy, and say, okay, this is the thought, the alarm bell's going off, like I need to eat as much as possible. I recognize my desire to like scoff the food down and shovel it down as fast as possible and get more and take a second plate and eat beyond my fullness cues. But actually, like, now I'm not actually in this environment of scarcity. I'm actually, you know, I've got plenty of food. There's going to be food in a few more hours. There's going to be food tomorrow. I don't need to stuff myself silly, and I can always go back for more. There's probably going to be tons of leftovers. And actually, I'm overweight. I weigh 20 kilos more than I need to weigh, precisely because of this instinct. And so I have to not eat that way in order to not be 10 or 20 kilos overweight. So we have to kind of recognize that automatic thought that is very instinctual and helped us survive in the ancestral environment, but is no longer helpful because we're in a totally different food environment today. Incidentally, this is why you also want your children to eat as much as possible. And while we feel so much satisfaction when our kids eat a lot, we get this like dopamine release. Like, my kids are super fussy eaters and they don't eat very much. I always joke that they're like doing photosynthesis. But when they do eat a big plate full of food, or they do eat a large amount of food, I feel this like dopamine release of like, yay, they're eating. Yeah, it's so good to see, especially if they're eating something that's very nutritious, something that I've made. And that is also like an evolutionary drive. And it can also lead us astray because it can also cause us to feel good when our kids are eating junk food, right? Which they really probably don't need. Again, I'm not this crazy anti-junk food person, but like snacks and things like crisps, chips, chocolate, sweets, all that stuff that children love to eat and that we love to eat is ultra processed, highly palatable, made in a like a laboratory by clever food scientists who are made to like engineer something that is like a party in your mouth. And they're very, very, very calorie dense and very, very low in nutrients, right? So we can also notice that with our kids, that we feel good when they're eating, even if they're eating unhealthy foods, and that actually we might need to stop ourselves and sort of go, hang on, do some rewiring here and say, maybe this isn't best for them to eat, and maybe I should stop them and tell them that they've had enough, or that they can have a little bit after they've eaten some less palatable, more nutritious foods, right? Again, I'm not this crazy person who doesn't let my children have any processed foods. They do have it, but we do have to be careful with the amounts. Like if you go to any swimming pool or any local park, you see the children of this generation are getting very, very, very fat, and it is going to be bad. It's going to set them up badly for adulthood. So we do actually have to restrict our children with how many calories they're consuming and where they're getting those calories from. And that, again, is very countercultural and very unpolitically correct, but it is the truth, and it's based off of a correct conceptualization of the problem rather than this la land, nice to thing that sounds nice that we tell people. Okay, I went on a bit of a tangent there, but I think it's all relevant. The sixth thing that we can learn from evolutionary biology is this thing called postprandial somnolence. What that means is, okay, a lot of people think when they feel sleepy, when they're having a bit of an energy dip in the middle of the day, they think, right, I need some food because I need energy. But what they're experiencing is not physical tiredness. They're not experiencing tiredness because they don't have enough calories. They're experiencing tiredness because they are mentally tired. They're mentally fatigued, not physically fatigued, right? If you go and do a long workout and then have a really busy day and don't eat and you're starving, right? That is a sign that you need to eat. But often people eat, like say in the afternoon, because they think they need calories, they think they need sugar, and they think they need, they're feeling this dip, but the dip is actually mental fatigue. And the only way that the food really helps you as a pick-me-up is because it's often sugary foods that then sort of set off our brain like fireworks. It's ultra palatable, tastes really, really, really good. And so we get like a little dopamine kick from it. It's not actually giving us energy in the way that we think we need it and in the way that we think it's giving us. Okay, so what most people think is you get low on energy, you eat, and that gives you energy. But it's actually the other way around. If you think about, when you eat a massive like Christmas dinner or a massive family meal, afterwards you don't feel this burst of energy. You feel tired, right? And that you feel lethargic, you feel sluggish. That is called postprandial somnolence. A fancy word, but post after prandial, meal, somnolence, tiredness or sleepiness, right? And we're made to when we eat loads, we then go into rest and digest. And when we don't eat or when we're hungry, we're in this more of a fight or flight type situation, or we're just more alert, right? So if you think about it in the evolutionary environment, it wouldn't make sense to get sleepy if you didn't have food. You'd probably get a bit of a high and be a bit ramped up when you start getting hungry because you've got to find food. And there's a bit of whatever cortisol, bit of stress hormones getting released to make you be a bit more alert and a bit more on top of it and go out and hunt. Obviously it gets to a certain point, if you've ever seen any of those survival programs where you've been many, many days without calories, your body starts to break itself down, you start to starve, you start to get very low energy, and your body starts to try to preserve energy. But that doesn't happen in the short term. It's actually the other way round. So this is why many people love fasting as well, is because they kind of get that real alertness that allows them to sort of focus more at work and things like that. Now, I'm not a fan of intermittent fasting. I've done a podcast on intermittent fasting. I'm not saying that's right for you. It's not right for me. But what people often think is going to happen when they start a diet program is they think they're going to get really tired and lethargic because they're not getting enough calories. But actually, what most of my clients report is when they start reducing their calories, they actually have loads more energy. Why? Because before they were eating far too much, and that was making them tired and sluggish and lethargic. And now that they're not getting so many calories, they feel more alert and more awake because they're not suffering from that postprandial somnolence, that rest and digest type state. And it's really important to recognize that, because a lot of people are scared of going on a diet because they think they're going to get really sluggish and all of that stuff. But you will get sluggish and you will feel shit if you cut your calories too low. And that's what most women have done throughout most of their lives. They've just done a really low calorie diet, and that sucks. And then you'll feel sluggish and tired because you're basically starving yourself. But if you fuel yourself properly, if you eat filling and nutritious foods, and if you eat at regular intervals, and if you manage your hunger so that you never get too hungry, you never go past a 6 or 7 out, you can lose body fat. But not only will you not feel sluggish and tired, you'll actually get more energy and you'll feel better if you go from overeating to eating a little bit less than what you actually need and being in a slight calorie deficit. Then you will feel 10 times better, you'll have more energy, you'll feel more alert, you'll have less brain fog, and you'll just feel physically less lethargic and sluggish. Again, this is backwards from what most people think, but if you understand the truth and the objective truth and the facts on the ground, you can then conceptualize the problem properly and come up with a correct solution, which is to eat in a mild calorie deficit, but to also eat very filling, very nutritious foods. Number 7, there is this myth in the HAES, Healthy at Every Size, and body positivity community and all the intuitive eating stuff, that if you honor your cravings, if you, gentle nutrition, if you listen to your intuition, you will naturally gravitate to your healthy body size. And that might be much heavier than someone else, or you might be morbidly obese, but that's your healthy size. Now, there is some grain of truth to that. If you take 100 different people, get them eating the right amount of calories for them, they're going to have different body shapes and sizes, and some people are going to have more body fat than others. But where body positivity and HAES is wrong is that it says that when you eat, that's true also for people who are extremely overweight or obese or morbidly obese, that might be just your healthy body weight, and that is not true. You will be healthier if you are overweight or obese. You will be healthier at a lower body weight. That doesn't mean that you'll be healthier when you're dead skinny and when you're size 0, right? That is also not healthy, right? There is such a thing. Again, healthy middle ground here, guys. Let's not swing from one extreme to the other. Just because being fat and obese and overweight is not healthy, that doesn't mean that being skinny is really, really healthy, okay? But being lean, we know that between the healthy range for women is somewhere in between 17% body fat and 33% body fat. That's a big range, okay? But that you can be a healthy weight within that. I would argue, I think the evidence shows that up towards the top end of that, up towards 30% body fat is not as healthy as being more towards 25, 24, 23% body fat, or even 20% body fat. But it is true that there will be a different point that you will settle for many people. Set point theory isn't completely true, but people will have different body shapes and sizes, but that doesn't include being very overweight or obese, okay? So that's just another myth in the current sort of body positivity trend. Okay, point number 8 that's really important to understand is that as your body weight goes down and as your body fat percentage goes down, your hunger will go up. And this is a really important thing to understand for dieting, okay? So let's look at it across the whole range, right? If you are morbidly obese, okay, or if you're really, really, really overweight, when you start to diet, if you start a diet on a moderate number of calories, you won't be hungry, right? Because fat, for the vast majority, that's not why people who are overweight eat. It's not from hunger. It's from boredom, it's from emotional eating, it's from habit, but it's not usually from hunger. And what I've seen and what we know as well in the scientific literature and whatever, but it's also common sense, right? The more body fat you have, right, the less hunger you will experience in a calorie deficit. Why? Because you have a lot of stored energy that the body can use. So what a lot of my overweight clients or clients that have a lot of weight to lose experience is that you get them in a 20% body deficit and they're not hungry at all, right? Because one of the reasons is that fat and adipose tissue actually secretes leptin, which is the fullness hormone, right? And there's a suppression of ghrelin. When you have high body fat percentage, there's a suppression of ghrelin as well, which is the hunger hormone. So you'll have a suppression of the hunger hormone and you'll have more of the satiety and fullness hormone leptin being released. Okay, that's the more body fat you have, the more that will be the case. So actually people who've got a lot of body fat to lose can actually diet at a higher deficit. They can sometimes get to a 30, 40 or even 50% calorie deficit and they won't actually be hungry. They'll be fine and they'll lose fat very, very quickly because their body is going to mobilize that fat very quickly and metabolize it in order to create energy. But as you get leaner, that becomes less true. And it's never more obvious than people who, I've had clients who've lost like 100 pounds from doing like low carb and exercise. And they've lost 100 pounds, but they're still overweight and they can't get beyond a certain point. They just can't lose any more weight using their previous techniques. And they have to actually start getting into, they have to start changing the approach. And it starts getting harder to lose weight the leaner you are, right? And this happens, when you go into like a normal weight range, if you're a woman and you go below 33% body fat, it will start getting harder than it was when you had a lot more fat to lose. And then this is even truer. Like if you've got like 5 pounds that you want to lose, right? I'm trying to do that right now, is lose like the last couple of kilos, the last 5 pounds. These are much, much, much harder to lose because once you get down to like 20% body fat or 21% body fat, you just don't have much fat to lose. And honestly, getting leaner probably isn't any healthier, right? It's probably not going to make you less healthy, but it's not actually healthier than being 17% body fat isn't healthier than being like 21% body fat, right? For the vast majority. And as you get leaner, your body will produce more ghrelin, more hunger hormone, because it wants you to maintain the fat that you have, and it will increase your hunger beyond your calorie needs. So it starts to get really tricky to lose weight, right? You can lose the vast majority of the weight and really get quite slim by, without ever really being hungry. But if you want to get really lean, it starts being a real balancing act to make sure you're getting loads of fullness from your foods. You can't eat, it's really hard to fit in fun foods and alcohol and things that are quite like nutrient poor and calorie dense. Even nutrient dense foods that are calorie dense are quite hard to get in because you'll just be too hungry on the number of calories that you have. So the leaner you get, the more your body will produce hunger hormones or hunger, whatever, and the more it will suppress the satiety hormones, driving you to gain weight. And this makes sense, right? Because if you go get underweight, let's say you get really, really, really skinny, your body should be driving up your hunger because you're starving, right? All it knows is that you're starving. You might be doing it because you think it's really cool to be size 0 and look like Victoria Beckham and it's the 1990s, but your body only knows that you're like starving, right? And it will drive you to eat more calories. So this is just something that's important to understand. Both if you have a lot of weight to lose, you need to understand it because you can understand that you don't need to be scared of being hungry, right? You can quite easily get in quite a big calorie deficit without being hungry, or you should be able to if you eat the right kinds of foods. And if you are very, very skinny or very lean and trying to get a bit leaner, you need to manipulate things like fullness from foods in order to get that little bit leaner. And it might not be worth it, right? It really isn't worth it for a lot of people. But if you do want to do it, you really have to manipulate that so that you get loads of fullness from the calories that you're eating, and then you don't feel hungry. And the final point that I want to make is that, number 9, is that you can't override hunger, right? it's not possible to just, like, what a lot of people think dieting is just being hungry for weeks or months on end. And this always fails, right? Whether people do like 1,200 calorie diets, or whether people do like some really restrictive, like low carb thing or whatever, they think that they need to just ride out hunger for weeks or months on end, and then that's how they will get to a healthy body weight. But this backfires, right? And the reason why it backfires, I don't want to go into this in too much detail, but this is this great concept of like a rider on an elephant that's our mind, that I use a lot with my coaching clients, that our mind is like the vast majority of our mind is like an elephant, right? And then the bit that we kind of identify with as being our mind is the like rational, logical, like planning ahead, thinking about the future part of our brain that's like the prefrontal cortex. And that's like a rider, a little human rider sitting on this enormous elephant, right? And we identify with the rider, the logical part, the bit that's planning. But what's actually driving us most of the time is this huge elephant underneath, right? It's driving us with our like instincts, our biological instincts, like leading us to like seek out sex, seek out relationships, seek out, to drink water when we're thirsty, to eat food when we're hungry. And you can't override that elephant. What we think it's all about doing is just being like, no, I'm not going to eat this. I'm not going to eat that. I'm not going to eat even though I'm hungry. But if you get hungry enough, the elephant is going to like stampede and take over, and that rider is not going to have any control over the elephant. So your tiny bit of your brain that's only evolved in the last few thousand years or whatever is not going to be able to override that huge part of your brain that's like your limbic system and like all of that stuff that's driven off of like dopamine and whatever, like oxytocin and all of these things. Like you're not going to be able to override that the elephant's going to take over. So what a lot of people do when they're dieting is they get really, really hungry, which works sometimes. They undereat during the day and it works. They're not eating very much during the day, but as they get tired later on in the evening, and the elephant gets hungrier and hungrier and hungrier, they have less access to that rational part of their brain. The elephant takes over, and then they're at the fridge at 2:00 in the morning, stuffing like food in their mouth, or eating their kids' leftovers at 5:00 in the afternoon, and eating loads of shit in the evening in front of TV, because the elephant's just going, get food in, get food in, get food in. And then once you're not hungry anymore, the rider comes back online and says, oh shit, what have you done? Like you've made all this mess. Now I'm going to have to clean up the mess. Why did you do that? And this is why I'm going to do a whole separate podcast just on this topic, but it's why it's so important to fuel yourself throughout the day, to spread your calories out throughout the day, and to never get too hungry. So I get my clients to eat breakfast, lunch, afternoon snack, and dinner. I get them to eat at regular meal times. I get them to figure out what's going to make them feel full and satisfied at each one of those meal times, because it's just not possible to just be hungry and get hungrier and hungrier and hungrier as the day goes on and still make good decisions. Okay. So, and I always get clients to eat when they're like, to recognize when they're like starting to get hungry, right? When they're like a 6 out of 10, and not to leave it until they get to a 10 out of 10, because then they're not going to be able to make good decisions about food. If you sort of go, oh, I'm a bit hungry, but I'm going to finish this bit of work. I'm going to keep going. I'm going to do this meeting. I'm not going to eat anything. I'm going to keep going. Busy. And then all of a sudden you go, fuck, I'm so hungry. Then you can't make good decisions about food. You'll go to the fridge and you'll just eat whatever's there, or you'll go to the canteen, you'll eat whatever's there, or you'll grab like something from the snack drawer at work and eat a Mars bar, and it wasn't a good choice, and it's not going to help you with your long-term goals. Okay, so the way that we keep the rider online and we keep working towards our long-term goals rather than instant gratification, we do that in several ways. We do it by planning. We have certain things that we plan and we automate. So eating the same time every day, eating certain meals all the time, repeating them. We make a plan at the beginning of the day for what we're going to have for lunch. We go and eat like what we're going to have for lunch, what we're going to have for afternoon snack, what we're going to have for dinner, right? We plan ahead a little bit, think about what we're going to eat, and how many calories we're going to eat, and what our portions should look like. And we also have to eat when we're at like a 6 out of 10, maybe a 7 out of 10, and not a 10 or 11 out of 10, because then we're going to make poor decisions. Like, you don't get extra brownie points, and you won't lose weight faster if you get starving hungry in between each meal, right? You're going to lose weight much more consistently consistently and get a control over your hunger and manage your hunger if you eat consistently when you're like a 6 or a 7 out of 10 and you never let yourself get too hungry. I could do an entire podcast on just that one, but I think I've got the point across. So that's it. That was a long one. If you're still here, just like pop me a comment or like send me a little message just to say that you're still here, that you listened to the whole thing, because this was almost an hour and I don't plan to make hour-long podcasts because like not many people are going to listen to them. But I think this is a really interesting topic and I'm interested to see how many people are interested in hearing about this. If this has helped you sort of like reframe it, like have a bit of a paradigm shift and think differently about losing weight, I'd really love to know. And if you would like to start losing weight, based on things that are actually reality and not fantasy, and things like this that will help you get in the right mindset for fat loss, I've got a couple of things for you. First of all, I have a free email course, fat loss. It's like a fat loss email course. It's just like a 10-day thing. It teaches you all the basics you need to know about losing body fat sensibly and like based on science and stuff. And I also have an online coaching program where I work very closely individually, one-on-one with people. So if you'd like to learn more about that, just pop me a message and we can book a call or I can send you some more information. And that's basically how it works. Cool. Thanks for listening.